Hello, and welcome to the first video edition of the Technique Only podcast. In this episode, we're going to be talking about holding, and I know holding scares a lot of people, especially new instrument students, so we're going to try to break it down in a reasonably understandable level. The first thing I want to do is look at a basic approach plate. A approach plate from Harlingen in this instance. It has a hold over the VOR as its missed approach point. We're going to use this hold to kind of talk about a few things with regard to holding. The first thing I want to do is take a closer look and see that the holding course of this given hold is 3-4-0, and the reciprocal of the holding course is 1-6-0. What this means is that when you're holding over this VOR, you'll be inbound on a 3-4-0 course, and then after passing the VOR, otherwise known as station passage, you'll be initiating a right-hand standard rate turn to a heading of 1-6-0. And then after timing for 1 minute, you would eventually initiate another right-hand turn back to intercept the holding radial. So the first thing I want to talk about here is going to be various types of holding entries and how we can more easily understand exactly how those holding entries work. The first thing I want to say is don't underestimate your ability to do holding entries in your head, right, with a very logical progression of thoughts. So if you are, for instance, due north of the Harlingen VOR, and you're flying to this hold, that means you would be coming in from this perspective, and it's pretty obvious to me, and maybe not to you, but it's pretty obvious to me that this is a parallel entry, because it's the only logical way to get into the hold. So a parallel entry would look something like this. We fly directly to the VOR, and then upon station passage, we're going to turn to parallel the outbound course, in this case 1-6-0. Also, it could be viewed as paralleling the radial that you're supposed to be holding on. And then after timing for a minute after station passage and wings level, you would then do a left-hand turn, because this is to the protected side or the holding side of the radial. And then you would continue this left-hand turn to set up an intercept to join the radial once again. You would then fly back to station passage, and then after station passage, you would initiate a right-hand turn to the outbound heading. So this would be a parallel entry. Pretty simple. You're coming in from the north, or maybe even from the northeast in this instance, and once passing the station, you're going to turn to parallel the course, otherwise known as flying the outbound heading, or the reciprocal of the holding course, and then after a minute you would turn back left to join the radial, fly the radial in, and then do that right-hand turn to get into the hold. Now this makes sense to me because it's really the only logical way to get into this hold coming from a northeasterly direction, right? So let's look at maybe a southerly direction. So let's say you're approaching this VOR from the south, and you need to figure out what kind of holding entry it would be. Well, it seems reasonably obvious that this, again, would be a direct entry because it's the only real reasonable way to get into the hold. So, for instance, coming from this direction, you would fly inbound, pass over the VOR, and then you would just simply do a right-hand turn to 1-6-0. And now you're in the hold. And that's the whole point of a direct entry. It's really simple. You're already somewhat aligned with the holding course of 3-4-0, and then you just simply do a right-hand turn to 1-6-0 to join the course. Now, that leaves one final entry left, and that's the teardrop entry. Now, the teardrop entry would be anything coming from this quadrant over here, right, to the northwest of this particular hold. And what it would look like is you fly inbound to the VOR, and then once you get over the VOR and you have station passage, you turn to 30 degrees to, in this instance, the left of the reciprocal of the holding course. So this would be a course of 130 here. And then you would time for 1 minute. And then after 1 minute, you would initiate a right-hand turn to join the course back in. And then, of course, you would fly to station passage and then initiate that right-hand turn to the outbound of the holding course. So the first thing that I want you to realize about holding is I don't want you to underestimate your ability to figure it out in real time just by logic. If I'm to the west of this hold, it's pretty obvious it's going to be either a direct entry if I'm coming from slightly down here, or a teardrop entry maybe if I'm coming from slightly up there. It's going to be direct all the way around to maybe here. And then once we get over to this quadrant, it's probably going to be a parallel entry, right? Now, talking about quadrants, this brings us to the HSI and how to use, this hand thing that we do for right hand holding, or this one for left hand holding, and that will hopefully make a little bit of sense as well when we look at the Texan Trainer. So let's pull up the Texan Trainer here and put ourselves in a similar position to where we were on that hold, right? So let's do it from the south, for instance, first, and we're going to twist the CDI to the holding course of 340. Now, the reciprocal of the holding course in this case with this setup is going to be the tail of the needle. So let's set ourselves up directly inbound toward the VOR from the south. Now, one note is, how do I know that I'm in from the south? Well, it's by looking at the tail of the green needle, right? The tail of the green needle is always where you are or where you live, right? You live on the tail of the green needle. So looking at the tail of the green needle, well, we know that we are south of the station, and if we look at the DME over on the left, we know we're at 10.5 miles. So we've twisted in the holding course, and we know that the reciprocal of the holding course is 160, and because of that, we can tell that this is pretty solidly a direct entry. In fact, probably like the most solid direct entry you can get. Now, I'm going to draw on this real quick in order to explain what I mean by it's solidly a direct entry. Now, the reason we hold our right hand or left hand up is because it gives a pretty good approximation of the holding entry amount of degrees for each type of entry. Now, the smallest one, the 70-degree teardrop entry in your right hand, is obviously between these two fingers, and the 110-degree parallel entry is between these two, and then everything else around here would be a direct entry. So let's look at what that looks like on the HSI. So with this, we can tell that this entry to this 340 hold is a direct, and we can see that because it's definitely not a teardrop. Remember, we were looking at the reciprocal of the holding course. Now, if the reciprocal of the holding course fell within this region from our heading over to 70 degrees to the right of our heading, which would be something like over here, then that would result in a teardrop entry. If it resulted in something 110 degrees to the left of our heading, then that would result in a parallel entry. So from here to our heading here, that quadrant to the left would be parallel. And what that means is that everything in this 180-degree quadrant down here is going to be a direct entry. The direct entry in this instance is pretty obvious because that reciprocal of the holding course, that 160, otherwise known as the tail of the CDI in this instance, is solidly in that 180-degree quadrant to the bottom half of the CDI. Now, what I think is important to recognize here is that you can practice these holding entries for any type of hold at any VOR or even any point-to-point really easily using something like this Texan Trainer, right? So let's go back to the Texan Trainer and we'll play around with a bunch of different holds and two different ways of doing it. The first is that I'm going to continue heading inbound to the VOR using my wind diamond on the head of the VOR needle. Now, this isn't the right way to fly to a VOR. In order to fly directly to a VOR, you want the CDI to be centered up on the green needle. So what that would look like is actually something like this, where you have the wind diamond just barely to the right of the head of that green needle, affecting a change toward that deviation to start to bring that CDI back to centered. But let's say, for an instance, that we don't need the CDI right away, or we're okay with homing for just a moment, and we want to plug in a bunch of different holding courses and practice determining which holding entry we need to use. Well, in this instance, we can just continually change the CDI to the holding course. Now, you remember that the original holding course was 340. That one is obviously a direct entry. We're approaching the field from the south, and it's an obvious right-hand turn to get into the hold. But let's say we have a couple different holding courses. We can kind of run through a little drill here. So let's say the holding course is 120. This is a parallel entry, because in this instance, the tail of the CDI is solidly in the 110 degree to the left quadrant that we mapped out here. And if we continue this drill, we can do a bunch of other holding courses. What if the holding course was 150? Well, that's a parallel. What if the holding course was 210? Well, that's a teardrop. What if the holding course was 240? Well, that's on the border between being a teardrop and being a direct entry. What if the holding course was 090? That's a parallel entry. What if the holding course was 330? That's a direct entry. And you can see that I'm very quickly able to determine what type of holding entry I'm doing just by looking at the tail of the CDI once I dial the holding course in. Now, of course, this is all for right-hand holding, and you would have to wrap your brain around flipping it around for left-hand holding, but that's not that difficult either. So for left-hand holding, the 70 degrees is to the left of your heading, the 110 degree for a parallel is to the right of your heading, and then the 180 degree direct section is just anything that's left over. So let's do a couple examples of left-hand holding using the CDI. So with this holding course of 330 in a left-hand hold, this is a direct entry. Left turn to join, fly heading 150. Let's do a holding course of 030, also a direct entry. Let's do a holding course of 090. This is a direct entry because it doesn't quite meet that 70 degrees to the left needed for a left-hand hold teardrop. Let's do a holding course of 150. This is a left-hand teardrop, right? Because it's 70 degrees to the left of our heading. Let's do a holding course of 210. This is a parallel entry. Let's do a holding course of 240. This is also a parallel entry. So by using this app and just practicing different holding entries, you can get a really confident sense of, hey, if this is my heading to the VOR, or even to my point-to-point, I could just really quickly twist in the CDI to the holding course, look at the tail of the CDI, and then figure out which holding entry it is. And you can do a million of these very quickly, to the point where you are very confident with your holding entries. Now, earlier I said that this isn't the right way to get to a VOR, right? This would be called homing, and we don't want to home, we want to track a course. So I'm going to twist in the CDI to be more lined up. Now, you don't have to use the CDI to figure out your holding entry. You can also use the heading bug, or you can just look at the heading. That's the reciprocal of the holding course, right? But we can also use the heading bug, and that's quite easy as well. So let's say the holding course is 270. That means the reciprocal of the holding course is 090. So let's take the heading bug and change it to 090. And for a right-hand hold, this is a direct entry, because it's more than 70 degrees to the right of your heading that's taking you to the VOR. Let's try another one. Let's say the let's say the holding course is 030. That means the reciprocal of the holding course is 210. That again is a direct entry. Let's say the reciprocal of the holding course is 330. That is a parallel entry in a right-hand hold. Would also be a teardrop entry in a left-hand hold because it's within the 70 degrees to the left of our heading. So by doing this, and by doing this drill, you can just plug in a bunch of different holding courses and figure out which entry would be best. Now, you have to memorize the procedure for the holding entry. You have to know that once you've established that it's a direct entry, you do a turn in the same direction as the hold to the reciprocal of the holding course. Or if it's a teardrop entry, you turn 30 degrees to the protected side of the hold. And if it's a parallel entry after station passage or after your point-to-point's complete, then you turn to the reciprocal of the holding course or the outbound holding course or the outbound heading, and then fly that. You have to memorize those procedures in order to be good at this, but figuring out the entry hold is just about half of the battle. Now, once we're actually in the hold, we have a couple of things to contend with. The first thing I want to talk about is the no-wind orbit. In the no-wind orbit, you basically ignore the winds, wait for station passage, and then start your turn standard rate to the outbound heading. And then you continue the hold, and after 1 minute, you start another turn in to get yourself on the radial. Now, in that no-wind orbit, you will get pushed left or right based on the winds. So let's go back to our Texan trainer here, and we're going to plug in the hold of 340, and we're going to simulate station passage. And I'm going to play this at holding airspeed of 150 knots. And we're going to watch basically how long this takes. So we're going to go into a standard rate turn after station passage, and we're going to look at what happens with these turns. The first thing you'll notice is that the deviation bar goes way out to lunch. It goes back behind you because you're flying away from the radial that you're supposed to be on. We're going to continue this right-hand turn until we're on the outbound. And then we're going to, because it's a no-wind orbit, we're going to end up on 160, the reciprocal of the holding course. And I apologize, every one of these turns is going to take 1 minute because it's 180 degrees of a standard rate turn, which of course is 3 degrees per second. And we'll bring that up in just a little bit as well. So once we're on the outbound, we're going in a no-wind orbit to just fly 160 on our heading. Overshot just a little bit there. I'll come back. And then once the needle is abeam our wing, we consider that to be abeam the station, and that's when we start our timer. And we're going to fly outbound on this heading for approximately 1 minute. And then after 1 minute, we're going to initiate a turn back toward the deviation bar in order to get back onto the radial. I can already tell that my winds, because of my wind bug, are coming out of the southwest, which means I am absolutely going to probably not get back all the way to the VOR because the winds are pushing me away from the deviation indicator. So I'm going to initiate this right-hand turn, and we're going to see what happens when I roll back out on 340. We're going to be able to figure out where the winds have really come from here. Alright, so you can see that throughout the entire turn, I am turning back toward the deviation, or the deviation bar of the CDI. You can also see that the wind is very clearly pushing me away, and I'm going to need to roll out and set up an intercept. Now we're reasonably close to the station, about 3 miles away, so I'm just going to slowly set up a double the angle intercept and allow that needle to come back to center. And then hopefully I can time my turn to rejoin the deviation bar when it's just about centered up. Now the no-wind orbit tells us that, okay, the wind is from the southwest, and that's important to know because I need to make my wind correction there. We can also, once we get on the radial, figure out how many degrees away we need to hold in order to figure out our triple the drift calculation. Now, if you look at the difference, I'm going to get the heading bug out of the way. I'm going to change it to 160. If you look at the difference between the heading bug and the wind diamond, in this particular instance, we can see that it's about 4 degrees. Now, that's probably the amount of degrees that I need to use to hold myself on the radial on the inbound course, which means my wind correction in this instance is 4 times 3 because we need to triple the drift. The drift is 4 degrees and I need to triple that. Here comes station passage and I'm going to start my turn to the right, which is of course the direction of the hold. Now I've already calculated that my triple the drift number is 12 degrees and I need to put that into the wind. And as I've mentioned several times, the wind in this scenario is out of the southwest. So if my outbound holding heading is 160, I need to put the holding correction, the wind correction, into the southwest, which would make that outbound heading 172. 12 degrees favoring the southwest from that initial 160 heading. So I'm going to continue this turn until we're at 172, and hopefully the wind correction that we put in works well and we end up closer to the radial at the end of our next turn. Alright, so here I'll roll out on 172. I'm going to change the heading bug to 172, and then we're going to time for 1 minute. Now you can see here that my little airplane is crabbed into the wind. The wind is coming out of the southwest, and I'm going to be crabbing into it the entire outbound leg. Now, one common question is, well, why do we triple the drift? Why don't we single the drift or double the drift or quadruple the drift? Well, we triple the drift because we have 1 minute on the outbound leg to accommodate for 3 minutes of things. We have 2 standard rate 180 degree turns, each of which takes a minute. And we have one 1 minute outbound leg. So to accommodate for those 3 minutes of correction on a 1 minute outbound leg, we triple the drift. And that explains why if you have to go longer than a minute because there's a headwind on your way back in, I'm going to start my turn here back to the course. If you have to go longer than a minute because of a headwind on the holding course, then you only go to single the drift after a minute. And that's because you've already accommodated for the 2 turns in the triple the drift for 1 minute. All right, so as we turn back toward the deviation bar, you can see that our hold with our little airplane logo is oriented significantly closer to the southwest. And that makes sense because that is how we corrected with our wind correction. Now we're going to hold this standard rate turn until we basically get back to the radial. And we'll see how good we were with our wind correction. And you can see that it was probably a little too much. 12 degrees, maybe a degree or two too much. But I'm going to roll out and set up a small, slight intercept using the wind diamond on the right side of the green CDI head. And then we're going to fly inbound to the station. We're going to reset our timer. and then we are going to head inbound to the station. With the wind diamond slightly to the right of the green needle and slightly on the side of the deviation, it's going to drive that green needle back to the head of the white needle, and that will mean that that deviation will eventually come in. Now here, I know that my 12 degrees was maybe just a little too much, so I'm going to go maybe 10 degrees, 170 on the next outbound heading in order to correct my wind correction a little bit more to the right area. All right, we're almost at station passage. I started the timer a little late, but we're somewhat close to a minute. And just for instructional sake, let's say that it did take us 53 seconds in order to get into the station. We want the inbound hold to be 1 minute, which means we should add about 7 seconds to the outbound hold, which means our timing correction on the outbound is going to be 1 minute and 7 seconds. We're going to triple the drift for 1 minute and then single the drift for 7 seconds and then initiate the turn back in. Now, every time you do a lap in holding, you should be adjusting your wind corrected heading and you should be adjusting your timing based on how long it takes you to get into, or based on how long it takes you to get into the station. One thing that I think is important to note is that you can kind of cheat when it comes to the no wind orbit. And what I mean by this is, let's say you are established away from the station. You're not in the hold yet. Or maybe you are in the hold in the entry orbit, and you're either on the inbound or outbound. We can actually take this plane, I'm going to pause this here, and we can move it. Now, let's say I'm flying into this hold from the north, and I am headed toward the station, basically on the reciprocal of the holding course. So this course is roughly 160, and in this instance, I can look at the wind diamond and see that it's about 4 degrees away from my heading, and I'm on a heading of 160. So I know that on the outbound of this hold, the wind diamond is going to be about 4 degrees away from my heading. And then conversely, let's bring the plane down south. Let's twist 340 back in, and let's turn the plane around. You can see that when I'm inbound to this station, even though I'm not perfectly lined up, I can see that the wind diamond is about 4 degrees away from my heading. So I'm 8.2 miles away from this hold. I'm not even in it yet, but I know that my wind correction on the outbound is going to be somewhere around 12 degrees, because that's the difference between my heading and the wind diamond when I am in line with the holding course. And again, you can also do it when you're on the reciprocal of the holding course. You really just have to wrap your brain around the fact that it's the opposite side when you're on the reciprocal, right? But if you know where the winds are coming from, you know the winds are coming from the southwest, you know the wind diamond is 3 or 4 degrees away from your heading, you triple that, and then you put your outbound holding heading into the wind, in this instance, into the southwest. All right, that's my 30-minute spiel on holding. I hope it makes a little bit of sense, and I hope you can practice some of these drills and better understand some of the holding entries and why we triple the drift and how we can do a little bit of an educated guess, let's call it, on what your outbound heading will be during a given hold. Thanks for joining, and I'll see you on the next one. It's going to be all about point-to-points. I hope you love it. Thanks. See you later.